All right, let's get started. So, Anuraj, are you live streaming?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Yeah, so Gordon, you want to do a few opening remarks and then we can kick off the discussion?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. As a guest. So I'm Gordon Brander. I'm founder of Subconscious, which is a notebook that thinks with you, powered by AI and a decentralized knowledge graph. So there's sort of two parts to what we're doing. We're building an app that sort of broadly fits into this genre of tools for thought. And we're also building a protocol that powers the app, a decentralized protocol called Newsphere. So you could sort of, I guess, maybe squint and say this is sort of like what if Notion or Rome, but a protocol. And the protocol itself is in a similar genre to maybe something like Farcaster or App Protocol. Um, and and like those protocols and products, there's a sort of distinction between the protocol layer and the product layer, which we can get into in a moment. But the protocol is roughly in that genre, but it's focused on this problem of building persistent collaborative graphs of notes and knowledge versus something like blasting out tweets. So similar values, perhaps, but different problem that it's trying to solve. And I'm particularly interested in the challenge of thinking over the network, learning to think together with other people and with AI. The reason I recommended this article, even though it's a little bit, not oriented toward protocols this week, is I heard a lot of questions last week about, how does this fit into a bigger picture, or like how is a protocol going to succeed without a product? All questions that I broadly agree with. Actually, I think most protocols that we've seen succeed had a product that they shipped with that sort of solved a first need. And then many actually evolved in multiple divergent directions after that. But the product is key. So for us, that's Subconscious, which is this sort of AI powered notebook. Um, so I guess maybe just quickly, I'll say what I think is important about this genre of tools for thought, things like Notion or Rome, is they're sort of new forms of hypertext, or really they're old forms that have been resurrected. So it's not an accident that Notion and Rome talk a lot about Engelbart and Kay and Vannevar Bush. What's happening is we're exploring a rich evolutionary history of hypertext that these were sort of paths that were cut off by the success of the web. And it turns out, if you teleport some of those cool old versions of hypertext that existed before the web into the present, into our sort of pervasively networked multiplayer context, that it does a lot of cool things. And then we also have this sort of convergence of AI, which I see as an important tool for thought. So really what we're building toward is a hybrid between a tool for thought and an AI powered by a distributed protocol. I think it's really important for people to own their own thoughts. This is a values thing for me. I know I've invested in tools that appeared and then later disappeared, and I ended up losing years worth of thinking. I think this challenge of thinking and thinking together has like a quality to it where you want the kind of open infrastructure that allows you to own your data. And I will broadly observe that in general, sort of going back to folks like Clayton Christensen or folks at SFI, like often things are invented in a kind of vertically integrated and closed way and then scale in an open way. And interestingly enough, these old forms of hypertext that came before the web, they were great in a lot of ways, better than the web in a lot of ways. We think of things like HyperCard or Engelbart's hypertext systems, but they didn't have that pervasive horizontal networked layer. And I see a weird kind of echo. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Like we've got now this pervasive networked culture, but it's re-centralized in a lot of ways, like the internet is re-centralized. And I think we've got these cool new forms of hypertext, but they're broadly sort of siloed around a single product. And I'm kind of curious what would happen if you took the web's approach to the problem and created this broad horizontal protocol layer what kinds of new thinking at scale might emerge from something like that. So that's sort of a big picture. Hopefully that helps orient us and frame up what we're doing and why. And I'll stop there.
All right. So thanks, Gordon. And yeah, the way we usually do these calls is people react and pass on to the next person on the list, skipping over people who are in silent mode. So today we'll start with commits and pass down. So commits, Grigory, I think Na is on listen, and Nathan, Sachin is on listen, and Steven, me, Jenna, and then back around to Anant and then Ben and Raj is also listening. So commits, take it away.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for the introduction as well, Gordon. So I guess I have there's two things I'm curious to hear you respond to when it comes back around to you. One is you sort of point to this idea of creating like a kind of journal, like an AI journal, or AI kind of companion that you could pass down. And this raises a whole bunch of different questions around the concept of death, life cycles. There's been some really good work done by Tamara Denise, where she talks about kind of the problems that you're talking about of investing in these products and then having all that information lost because the companies are working on a kind of venture capital model and invest like the whole startup the culture is kind of premised on like how quickly can you fail and like how many kind of enterprises can you set up. So like death and that kind of life cycle is just a kind of perpetual part of it. But anyways, I guess what I'm curious about with this particular angle is, how are you thinking about or the ideas of kind of lifetimes or being able to actually kind of deal with the things that we leave behind, maybe things like distributed delete, like how can we actually kind of take an orientation to this protocol and this product that isn't just based around pervasive and persistent archival processes. So I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about some of those things, but then I'm also curious to hear you talk maybe a little bit about, and this maybe is a little out of scope, but maybe you have some thoughts on this. Basically, the question of governance in a multiplayer web. So I think of tools like projects like Croquet, which is sort of based around something Cooper and LK, small talk experiments. And they have this video where they're demonstrating them working with the Q desktop, where they have this. Everyone's on the same desktop. They're all in a shared state using some sort of relay system, and everyone is able to control the scroll bar on the PDF reader. And so the person who's presenting it has to say, please do not scroll the PDF reader because everyone has access to the same state. And there's a bunch of applications for this when you start thinking about the internet, and basically that when you consider that most of our time online is individual atomized experiences, we have platforms where we go and we kind of network with each other, but we don't actually get to kind of cohabitate in kind of very meaningful ways on the internet. And so I'm curious with this kind of work that you're doing, how you're thinking about governance structures for, coexisting like on the web. So those are the two things that come to my mind. And with that, I'll pass it to David.
All right. I would say that artificial intelligence that thinks together with you is a problematic idea. Or can be problematic idea. In my view, AI knows exactly what is known and can iterate on it. It does not know what is unknown, and there is always more unknown than known around us. an interesting example, because there was a world championship in chess happening right now, is that a chess player is using a very powerful computer with artificial intelligence to prepare for a tournament. But as far as I know, it is not called thinking together with a computer. A person uses a computer to learn the lines. The computer that is providing the lines and calculations is not thinking either. But I admit that it depends on your definition of thinking. What do we do exactly when we are thinking? Now, if you think about artificial intelligence as something that keeps a log for us, as far as we know about nodes, to have good nodes is the opposite of having, a lot of nodes. To have good nodes, you have to be very selective. It's not just, dumping all the details in the conversation. This type of nodes are meaningless. Finally, pattern recognition is very interesting, but ultimately it hinges on the ability of the artificial intelligence to articulate the patterns back at you. It observes some patterns, but then it needs to articulate it somehow. And of course, two brains, as far as we know already, are not necessarily better than a single brain. Two brains are more complex, yes. They have more inner dialogue, yes. But also they have more risk to turn into an echo chamber. And echo chamber, as far as I remember, is an idea of Tim Urban, who compares and contrasts with the idea lab. It's an interesting distinction, in my view. You want to create a tool that helps you to build an idea lab, not an echo chamber. But at the same time, every tool that is too close to you, can read your mind, for example, or can read your notes, has a great risk of just being an echo chamber. And the last comment is the beauty of human societies is that there are always people around us who disagree with us, who disrespect us, who don't listen to us, who avoid us. And they are there for a reason. We are constantly learning to deal with these types of reactions. And this reminds us about, necessity of being better at communication and thinking and doing stuff. People learn from failures more than they learn from being in comfort with your tools. So we need some tools, but we also need a technique to avoid getting too comfortable under our own skin. And I will pass it on to Nathan, I believe.
Sorry for the delay there. So I think I'm most interested in the some of the protocol aspects. I was just trying to write up questions. I'll drop those in the chat right now. But I think I'm kind of, after reading a lot of these documents, it feels like I think there's a lot of I've seen a lot of hate around the same origin policy. Maybe hate is too strong a word, but a lot of people, not just you, Gordon, have seemed to identify that as a real source of centralization. I think that's definitely a correct take, but it also, the same origin policy actually solves some real things. Having done a little bit deeper dive into some of your writing now, it feels like the idea here is to kind of get around the problem same origin is trying to solve around untrusted code by creating really separate spheres around there's authentication, there's document storage, retrieval, display, and then there's document creation, update, delete kind of thing. And sort of never the twain shall meet in a way. And by kind of separating these out as separate spheres, you now break the links that created some of the danger of executable code in the browser. So I think one of the things I'm curious about is just, does this seem like the right take? It seems like there's a lot of projects. I mentioned Gemini before the call, the Gemini protocol, that seem to be moving in this direction of trying to break centralization and the centralizing tendency of same origin by explicitly separating out sort of the spheres of action that one can take on data. And so I'm curious if that's the right take on your thoughts. I'm also curious how private documents work in the system. I'm assuming, but I haven't seen it stated anywhere, that the idea is the user would upload an encrypted document. Okay, so private, and so Gordon saying in chat, private for us means end-to-end encryption. So then I guess there's sort of question of how sharing works in this context there. Private versus public documents. Do we have some documents that are end-to-end encrypted, some that are not? How do you have documents that are shared among only some people? I think those are sort of some interesting questions, or if this is something we're saying, it's not really a protocol problem, this is something an application builds on. So those were sort of my thoughts and questions there. I think I am pretty interested in sort of like the AI spinning through things, but I've become a little bit nervous investing in anything so that is not local first. So the fact that Noosphere seems to be trying to be both local first and have some of that sync capability is kind of exciting. So that's very quickly all the thoughts that I was having. I will pass on to Stephen.
So yeah, I mean, I've been kind of too lazy to make a second brain, and all I've been doing is like making like a big list of bookmarks on my browser, but then it just ends up being a trash heap, and I never end up going back to it. But I would love something that could save all these sources and for me to go back on it. And I thought about how maybe possibly an AI could help me like summarize some thoughts or gather some thoughts from what I've read long ago and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't really understand the protocol very much, to be honest, because I wasn't here last week, but it seems like a promising idea to use AI to kind of summarize things. I'm just a bit concerned about being able to track back and try to get more depth, because very often I want to really, really get the details and really, really understand it rather than a broad stroke, which AI kind of does. So like search seems like a better tool for that. And so I'm wondering about the trade-offs between search versus like AI output and how you can use both or one or the other, or which one might be the better tool in a sense. But yeah, I've been kind of lazy and it's just been kind of there. I'm also wondering about what is the purpose of the protocol, because generally number one, I don't understand it fully, but generally most of my notes are very private and I don't really share much of it, and it seems very to the outside person, probably my notes would probably be hard to understand for a lot of people. So I'm not sure if there's a lot personally. I don't think there's a ton of benefit of sharing a lot of it, but until it's like a bit more organized, I guess. But and maybe I'm wrong about that. Venkat?
Right. Yeah, this is kind of an interesting direction to think on, and I'm trying to think what it might look like to go from a personal ROM to kind of like an encrypted personal local first, but somehow multiplayer and social version of Rome. We're kind of using Rome in that way here at the Yak Collective a little bit, but honestly, we haven't really pushed the multiplayer usage patterns much. We have like some shared areas, like the rover project maintains documentation here, and we kind of like edit stuff, but it's really more like a shared repository rather than thinking together in like any significantly complex way. So I would say if you were to like draw a map of our content on the Yak Collective Rome, you'd find that apart from like a few interaction points, it's mostly like we've created little islands for pages we individually curate. So some of us take care of some pages, others take care of other pages. And also I'll say that initially when we started, we were using Rome a lot more, but increasingly we've started I think lazy defaulting to using some of the bots here on Discord to record, for example, links. So it's like almost things settling on more conversational, interactive command line type media, which I think is indicative somehow that it's easier to interact in conversation mode. So that says something about how we might interact with AIs. But yeah, using Rome personally, definitely it feels very different from using a word processor. It's not just that I'm thinking thoughts coming up in an idea and writing it down. Using Rome, even in its current state of the art, feels much more like I have like a thought partner, because I can sort of capture connections between ideas. And when I go back, one of the things that really convinced me to jump on board Rome, and which I think slightly more polished and more featureful tools like Notion actually don't get to. So Rome in some sense is more researchy, advanced tool, even though Notion is slightly more polished. But one of the things that got me thinking that it was I would often go to add like a little note or link to the Rome and discover I had already put it there. So it actually persists and captures just below conscious awareness type connections, even in its current kind of passive form. So it's like already a slightly AI intelligent bot. And I was starting to think, I noticed now posted Ian Cheng's Bob documentary that's worth watching of like how much that can get advanced. But my use of Rome currently feels like I've gone from walking to maybe riding a bicycle for the brain on relatively empty streets by myself. So there's some leveraged effects of moving faster, but it's not really yet at the level where it feels that different from just a faster form of walking. So what I'm thinking is if you compare something like notebooking along this trajectory of technological improvement to something like, say, driving, and you go from like walking on country roads to maybe biking on mostly empty country roads to like driving in a modern city like LA, where there's like tons of cars moving at very different velocities in complex highway systems. And now all of us have internalized a whole bunch of new behaviors, like, driving at very high speeds, changing lanes, an entire protocol of traffic behaviors that's very different from walking behaviors, how you do right and left turns, how you follow traffic signs. So traffic evolved from being like, walking plus plus to slightly faster walking to now its own whole different thing. And I think along that spectrum of evolution, we are now at the walking plus plus stage of behavior. And I think trying to get to like a full vehicular traffic level, especially via this encrypted personal AI route, it's actually kind of hard to visualize, because I can see myself talking privately to an AI in an encrypted way and maintaining almost an enhanced second brain that I access almost subconsciously. So I'm reading currently Greg Egan's Permutation City, and there's a similar conceit over there where people are able to like make copies and clones of themselves. But one of the things these versions of you can do is like take snapshots of your brain, or like choose to keep particular memories more strongly encoded and things like that. The part I think I'm having trouble seeing is how does this enhanced AI augment itself actually related to others with AI enhanced augmented selves? Like if I have like this AI enhanced memory of my thinking and you have one too, can our memories talk at the subconscious level without me needing to write an article for you to read, for example? So it feels like you don't have to, you can skip past this current mode of, I think thoughts, I record them, and at some point I might write very compact, readable versions of it that you read and then you integrate into your thinking. I think we can skip that chain of command type pattern entirely, where it bubbles up and then bubbles down into somebody else's brain, and instead maybe the memories can interoperate more directly. And I think that seems to be the intent of this protocol. Like, so we are in the same sphere and have like trusted nicknames, and you can kind of merge the streams of AI augmented memory somehow. But yeah, I have no specific questions, but this is how I'm thinking of it. So passing on to Anant.
Thank you. I'll keep it short, and I found the article really interesting. I sort of went on a rabbit hole of reading other articles on the Substack, the Subconscious Substack, and I sort of sense the sort of the evolution aspect of the protocol and the sort of note-taking tasks. I get a sense that the thinking is strongly influenced by sort of biological and biological evolution processes, and I found the idea of like information processing threshold really interesting along those lines, where the society reaches a point where there is a surplus of information and it sort of collapses with its inability to process those information. So it seems like an intelligent model in the loop would help with that evolution. So I'm completely on board sort of with that idea, and it's actually very exciting for me personally. The sort of AI-powered note-taking in some sense, and I sort of read the description of it, and that seems very exciting. AI that can riff and spar and sort of keep a running log of the thought. It's very interesting. So the question that occurred to me naturally was along those lines of how would that evolution of the model work in the protocol? I mean, I guess this is a product, not the protocol, but how will that work in terms of if there's a model that's sort of trained on if I can send it to be trained on specific knowledge graphs that are particularly interesting to me, in some sense that model is slightly different from other models that other users might have within the product. So how does that, I guess it wasn't quite clear on how that would work in practice. The other question was on the protocol itself, like, so the IPFS storage. I guess my other question was on the cost of the protocol. Like, if somebody were to, it seems like the protocol is sufficiently generative enough to build rich applications. So if you can, I'll post the question in the text too. But I'm interested to see how you guys think about giving access to other applications to the protocol, and like what does that look like. But yeah, I just found the entire reading very interesting, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that sort of evolutionary aspects and the protocol API or like the protocol access. I'll pass on to Ben.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I did find this article very interesting. I've had, I think, similar thoughts on how, if AIs are trained on data, you could make a specialized AI that's just sort of trained on you. And that might end up being useful. I'm not sure if anyone that's actually done that for any significant quantity of data from themselves. So I'm not sure it'll actually work. I mean, it seems like large language models really do just use the fact that so much is out there already that you can sort of piece together a good facsimile of a person with just, all this stuff. But I'm not sure that they'll be able to get enough out of you by yourself. I mean, unless you're trying to record absolutely everything you do. But even then, it might be too limited. But I do think it's an interesting idea. And yeah, so I think a lot of good things have already been covered. I'm not sure who's next. Brian?
I think, yeah, Brian is on listen. So, yeah, we're actually done. So, yeah, Gordon, 15 minutes left. So, feel free to just react to what you heard, scroll back up, look at the questions, and pick ones you have responses to. So, take it away. You have the floor again.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you. So many good questions. I don't know where to start. I guess I'll start by saying the Substack is sort of my outlet for my evolving thesis. So sometimes it's a little oblique, and I think that's partly deliberate. It's because I'm trying to sort of state a general case, and often there are paths not taken that I leave in there. Just to sort of, kind of sketch out why the articles read the way they do. I want to also just say I have this broad picture of AI that might be a little bit different from some of the narratives that that you see generally. So I think often AI is framed as a god or a servant, and the narrative is sort of replacement or conflict. The design space I'm really interested in exploring for Subconscious, the product, is AI augmenting human intelligence. I noticed Grigori's saying something about, AIs can only kind of return to the places that they already know. I totally agree. Well, at least for the moment, I mostly agree. I do think we're starting to see some interesting emergent capabilities in LLMs. But I think my perspective on this is heavily influenced by cybernetics and by ecology. I sort of made a note in the chat that intelligence is an emergent phenomena that happens in more things than just brains. It happens in a rainforest, it happens in a pond, it happens in a conversation between two or more people. If you've ever worked in a creative field and you've riffed with someone, and you have good chemistry, you know that both of you are suddenly just more intelligent than you were alone. So I think often of Gregory Bateson's notion of making circuit, or Pask's conversation theory, that learning and intelligence are sort of conversational phenomena between multiple actors. And that's the relationship that I would prefer to have with AI, a conversation between myself and the AI. And actually, it's sort of a three-way conversation. This is how I picture tools for thought. A sort of traditional tool for thought, like a notebook-style tool for thought, is a conversation between myself and myself over time. Venkatesh mentioned that there's a really interesting phenomenon that you get with Rome, where you start to write something and you realize you already started to stub for that thing. I love this effect. I also had this experience with a very old program called Notational Velocity that had a game mechanic that would cause you to bump back into old thoughts. And I see that as a conversation between yourself and yourself over time. It's a feedback loop that the app connects up that causes you to bump back into yourself fruitfully. And the distance in time between, the you that wrote that and the you that's thinking about something now, it's almost like you're two different people, right? So you're able to have this fruitful conversation that actually takes you in a direction that you didn't expect. This is also what I personally plan on doing with AIs. I think one of the most interesting things an AI can do is not answer a question, but help pull on a thread with you. So actually ask you good questions, or draw out related things that help you think new thoughts. And that's personally where I'm exploring the most from a product perspective. I also just wanted to make a couple notes on the protocol. So I know we kind of went all over the place, protocols, products. As kind of, my thought was orient with the product and walk backwards into the protocol and the why of it. But I just wanted to say products solve a problem. Protocols create new possibilities and new interesting problems. So that's kind of the distinction here between a protocol and a product. I recall last week somebody saying, well, why is this protocol so exciting? I think not many people are excited about HTTP either, but it sort of creates this new greenfield landscape in which we can solve new kinds of problems, usually more interesting problems at a higher level. Now, I want a couple of things out of protocol. I think, I'm heavily influenced here by the history of the internet and the web. Protocols are often best when they're open-ended. So there's a kind of interesting little dance you have to do, I think, to introduce a successful protocol. It has to solve a concrete problem in collaboration with an initial product. But for the protocol to really matter over the long term, it also has to be evolvable and open-ended. And that means designing in really careful ways. So like with Newsphere, we're solving for this problem of knowledge graphs and note graphs that are persistent and linkable. But we've also carefully layered the protocol so that you can add new layers on top to do new things and also repurpose parts of the protocol. So somebody mentioned Gemini. Actually, Gemini is, I like Gemini a lot. I like all of this sort of spate of new distributed protocols that are coming out. I think this is going to be sort of hot protocol summer in a lot of ways. Like Web 2 is just sort of plateaued in a way, shifted to exploit, and driven everyone in the direction of building these distributed protocols to solve different problems. Sorry, I'm a little bit all over the map, but I do want to maybe touch on some of Nathan's questions. Same origin and these sorts of things. What actually does the Newsphere protocol do? So the Newsphere protocol, my goal for that is or our goal, I should say, is to build a protocol that enables user-owned data. So we sort of pragmatically define ownership as credible exit, meaning you can take your stuff elsewhere. So we're not really assuming that massive infrastructure goes away. I think that there are inevitable returns to scale around things like big server farms. But what's unfortunate is some of the subtle choices that the web made produce lock-in when you have that kind of emergent, bottom-up kind of returns to scale, large-scale infrastructure. The reason is actually the web's answer for every question is it belongs to the server. So, how do you find the data? You ask a specific server. Who owns the data? The server owns it. How is JS, JavaScript secured in Sandbox? Well, the boundary is drawn around the server. What about the problem of security? HTTPS, that's also the server. Who owns the user's identity? That's the server. So this creates a lot of centralization and lock-in so that if, I don't know, like say a billionaire buys a website that you love, it's actually kind of hard to exit. There's a lot of friction. So in my ideal world, I don't think that centralization at the infrastructure level can go away. Moxie Marlinspike and others in the sort of distributed systems world have written convincingly about this. Barabasi and others have tackled it from the network theory perspective. But what I do think is you can sort of do your best to guarantee a kind of credible exit. So I would say that the minimum bar for sufficient decentralization of a tool for thought or a Roam or Notion like thing is you want to decentralize the data, decentralize the links, because if you move your stuff, you don't want every link to break, and then decentralize the authorization. So you could sort of broadly construe that as identity, but it's not necessarily just identity. It's also things like ACLs. So these are sort of the three problems that Newsphere solves. We use IPFS to decouple the data from a specific server. So we use content addressing. Then we layer a pet name system on top to decouple naming from a specific server. So this is a kind of decentralized linking scheme. And we use UCAN, which is a protocol that was developed by our friends at Fission based on some tech at Google called macaroons to solve the problem of authorization. This also lets us do end-to-end encryption, collaboration, using an object capability model. Let's see, what else? I'm trying to go through the laundry list while we still have time. Venkat had a note about Roam and this emergent pattern of little islands of pages that we curate. Yeah, I love that, actually. I've noticed that a lot too. I think this is a form of multiplayer I think is actually a pattern rather than an anti-pattern in many ways. And the first thing that Newsphere does is sort of secure all notes around something called a sphere. So you have this thing called a sphere. It's signed with a cryptographic key. Right now, one sphere roughly corresponds to one person. So it's like, here's my little sandbox. I work on my stuff. But what's interesting is you can sort of freely embed other people's spheres content into your sphere, and you get a copy. So it's a little different from the web. Like you actually get to carry the stuff with you that you link to, because everything's local first. You have your own little sort of internet archive. Now, in future, we're going to expand that, I guess, sort of almost like the equivalent of a multi-sig wallet, but a multi-sig sphere. But I actually think that this kind of collaboration where you sort of fork off into your own pocket universes and then join up works really well. It's roughly the kind of structure that GitHub has, right? You make a fork and then you do a pull request. And the nice thing about the kind of immutable data that IPFS gives you and the secure signing that Newsphere gives you is you have this version history. So I could fork something Venkat says, riff on it, and we still have this sort of retained history of authorship. I'll also note that in keeping with the sort of AI and humans as a collective intelligence together, I actually think Newsphere solves some interesting problems around the glut of information that LLMs are going to generate. So an LLM, can sort of take just about anything and sort of imitate just about anyone's voice. And I think this is going to break the web in some pretty fundamental ways. And a few people have written about this, but I think the ultimate solution is to sign everything with a key that only you can control. So this is sort of a little bit like the perhaps like crypto has this phrase, not your keys, not your wallet. Not your keys, not your data, I think is probably a future that we're looking at. And you can sort of hide all this away from the user, put it behind things like passkeys, fingerprint readers on your phone, that kind of thing. But ultimately, we need to be able to build trust around something AIs can't fake, and cryptographic signatures are something AIs can't fake. This is something we solved for Newsphere almost by accident, because when you build a distributed protocol, you can't root trust in the server, so you end up having to root it in the individual actor. And then we also have these, AIs, and it turns out to be a pretty good fit. You can actually build reputation back around basically the history of edits that an AI or a person does. Okay, I know I'm doing this in grab bag order, but maybe one last thought is people were sort of reaching for what does this actually look like in practice. I've described Subconscious, the app we're building, it a couple times. It's like a weird hybrid of a wiki and Twitter. I think things like Roam, things like wikis have this beautiful quality of when they work, of developing into a sort of Ostrom Commons, like small groups of people collaborating together over an intersubjective, over sort of shared truth. And at the same time, though, we often have these sort of streams of incoming information. So Newsphere has a little bit of both. You can subscribe to follow people rather, and you can also follow AIs. And you get updates. You can sort of save any of that content into your personal notebook. The way the AIs actually integrate with the notebook is that you follow them just like people, and following is sort of a trust relationship. So then by following, they get sandboxed access to some part of your notebook, and they can riff on it. And actually all an AI is in our system at the protocol level is a sort of, you can conceptualize it as a function that reads a sphere and publishes a sphere. So maybe if you squint, it's a little bit similar to the notion of a server on the web. So it's pretty open-ended. We're going to be doing a lot with LLMs, but probably also kind of hybrid systems. Actually, this is a whole other rabbit hole, but I think actually very dumb systems can be extremely generative. Like I think about something like Brian Eno's oblique strategies or Tarot or the I Ching. Like these are sort of generative systems that have a very carefully curated set of ingredients. And it's been my experience that if you combine the high context of a notebook of things that you care about because you took the time to write them down, and a sort of carefully curated set of ingredients for provoking new ideas, you can actually get really good results that way. So I see us doing some hybrid things there. What else should I talk about? And how are we doing on time? I guess 1 minute? Maybe I should just leave it there. Any parting shots?
Yeah, you have 1 minute left, so either you or anybody else have parting shots, as Gordon says. Yeah, this is, I think, we could go on and on about like a whole bunch of bunny trails. But one of the things, I guess, meta thought that occurred to me just doing this discussion is it's not just, summer of interest in protocols. There's the program I'm running, plus in general, the Blue Sky Forecaster thing just, or I'm thinking of that as a protocol war just started.
Yes.
I think there's also, on the demand side, a lot of people really want this stuff now. It's not just that on the product and innovation side, people are producing this stuff now. Because even look at how we are running these calls. Like, it just struck me that we do a very weird form of Q&A. We've done this with other guests in the past where everybody reacts, and then it creates a high burden on the guest to remember everything that was said and react. But I think this creates a very different but messier, interesting kind of Q&A session than if you had one question at a time and one response at a time, because then the guest has a chance to, connect common themes, address questions together, that sort of thing. And people asking questions have a chance to build on other people's via follow-up. So even that's a pattern that I think is almost like a preview of a future world where the infrastructure for this sort of like richer collective thinking is much stronger. Anurag just posted a question. I don't know where that came from, but yeah, you want to take that, Gordon? Yeah, Rust.
Yeah, we've liked Rust a lot. I think there's a little bit of overhead maybe in learning it, but it's meant that we can target both the web and native, which is a huge win. We've noticed a lot of other people working on protocols end up rewriting or using it. It just gives you a lot of flexibility in deployment. We've also, I want to say too, the product, Subconscious, is going to be entering a closed beta soon. The protocol is already out there, completely open source and completely open, right? So sort of like Farcaster and then I guess Warpcast, you have the product and protocol distinction. There's a similar thing going on here. We've created wrapper libraries for Node, for Swift, and I think in future there will be wrapper libraries for Python potentially. So we're hoping people find interesting uses for this beyond the ones that we imagine. That's part of the whole point of building an open protocol. You want to provoke new evolutionary exploration, and that's something I'm very excited about. Oh, what platforms will Subconscious initially be available on? So I'm focused on iOS and mobile in the beginning. We're also going to be doing a web app that will target desktop and Android in the future. But mobile first was really important to me. I think that there's a pretty broad space of tools for thought for the sort of desktop kind of problems that you want to solve. But for me, the best notebook is the one that you have with you, and the best personal AI is one that you probably want pretty close to you. So we ended up leading with the iOS app. Yeah, I feel you, Vortex. Actually, it's very frustrating to me that you can't just build a decent web app on iOS today. It's actually pretty good on Android, and I'm a web first guy. I worked for ages on Mozilla, on Chrome, like on browsers, right? So it was a painful choice, but I think it's been ultimately a good one for some of the technical foundations. Like this is how we ended up on Rust, for example. Okay, we're 3 minutes over. I should stop.
All right. Thanks a lot, Gordon. It's been great, and I'm sure we'll continue exploring these bunny trails. And yeah, feel free to join future sessions as well. And we'll probably circle back to some of your work when it's farther along and there's stuff to play with. When do you anticipate something will be launched? Like not the protocol, but on the app side?
The app side? Yeah, we're getting very close. So I think probably late this spring, maybe early this summer. The sooner the better. Basically, I'm in the process of integrating the protocol with the app as we speak and ironing out the bugs. So we're getting quite close.
All right, perfect. All right, thanks again, Gordon, and everybody will be back next week for our next study